All right, so this is the second video in our quick unit on new monarchies. So we're just going to jump right back in and talk about new monarchies, and this is part 2. And all we're going to do in this is look at a few more examples of some new monarchies. These are new monarchies that emerge under different circumstances. So England and France are both kind of tied together in those conflicts, the Hundred Years' War, and then the English continuing the fighting into the War of the Roses. Here we're going to look at a few examples of countries that also had what might be considered new monarchies, but didn't emerge from that conflict, the Hundred Years' War or the War of the Roses. So these are some other examples of new monarchies. Quickly, the first one I want to do is Spain. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on Spain because we're going to focus a lot of time on Spain when we talk about exploration. So we're just going to kind of do a quick look at Spain. But most of our time looking at Spain is going to be during exploration, so don't worry, you're going to get plenty of Spanish stuff, just not quite yet. So when we think about Spain, let's go back a little bit, like starting the time period. So in 1450, there was no Spain, the same way there was no Germany and there was no Italy. There were pieces of Spain. There were pieces of what will become Spain. And in 1492, oh, I'm sorry, wrong date. In 1469, the two pieces of Spain, we'll put it that way, two pieces of Spain were united through marriage. So these are Castile, and if you take Spanish and you see how Spanish from Spain is different from Spanish in the Western Hemisphere, the Spanish they speak in Spain is known as Castilian Spanish. And so that's the Spanish they speak in Spain. Sorry, that was kind of difficult to get out. So Castile and Aragon, who you might remember was the place where Henry VIII's first wife was from. So Castile and Aragon, you put them together, you get most of what is now known as Spain. So these two people, you've probably heard of them, Ferdinand and Isabella. So Ferdinand was from Aragon, Isabella was from Castile. We know them because they're the ones that sent Columbus on his journey to the West. Now, their big centralizing moment was uniting Spain under a Catholic flag. And what that means is they needed to kick out all the Muslims who still controlled pieces of the Iberian Peninsula. So the Iberian Peninsula is the peninsula that Spain and Portugal sits on. So it is this area. And so at the time we're talking about, the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula here was still controlled by Muslims. And so what Ferdinand and Isabella united to do, among other things, was to unite all of the Iberian Peninsula under a Catholic flag, which meant they had to kick the Muslims out. This process, which they succeeded in 1492. This was called the ReConquista, or the reconquering. And this is really important for understanding exploration, because once they took over the Iberian Peninsula again, they really wanted to continue spreading Catholicism. And it's like at that moment when they are really wanting to find a new place that they can spread Catholicism to, that's when Columbus walks in the door and says, "Hey, I would really like some ships to go find India." And they're like, "Will you spread Christianity there?" And Columbus is like, "Sure, I guess." And they're like, "Sold. Here are 3 ships. Go do that." But we'll talk more about that when we get to exploration. So this was their centralizing moment. So for England and France, it was the 100 Years' War. For Spain, it was the ReConquista. And it will continue under the exploration stuff when they start making all these colonies in the Western Hemisphere. So that's going to be their centralizing moment. Now, there's one more place that we need to talk about. It's not exactly a new monarchy, but we would kind of be dumb not to talk about it here, and that's the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the Holy Roman Empire was the backdrop to most of our stuff about the Reformation. So we knew about parts of the Holy Roman Empire. We talked about characters from the Holy Roman Empire like Frederick III, the Elector of Saxony, or Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor. So let's take a second and look at the Holy Roman Empire itself, even though it's not really a new monarchy. But now is kind of the best place to talk about them. So it's not really a new monarchy, but this is about as good a place as any to talk about it. So we've talked about like the basic makeup of it. It is at various times, and at most it was 300 plus Lil Germanies. So all of these places spoke German and had German culture. So they ate German food, they wore German clothing, all of that stuff, except they are very kind of loosely united under the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, the Holy Roman Emperor, I think we've mentioned this before, is an elected position, although elected isn't really right because the job is always given to a member of the same family, and that family was the Habsburgs. There were, I believe, 7 electors. And they elected the Habsburgs to be the Holy Roman Emperor. One of those electors was the Elector of Saxony, who was Martin Luther's benefactor. Another one of these electors we'll bring up later when we talk about England is the Elector of Hanover, who will eventually become the King of Great Britain. But we'll worry about that when we get to it. So there's 7 electors, one of which is the guy from Saxony, and that's his title. His title is Elector. So the Habsburgs managed to gain all this power through marriage and diplomacy. So they controlled most of Austria, which at this point is just part of the Holy Roman Empire, other pieces, so other little Germanies, but they also had title to Spain, the Netherlands, and then eventually, through exploration, most of the Western Hemisphere. And the guy that we are interested in is Charles V. We last saw Charles when he was ordering Luther to appear before the Diet of Worms. He is the guy in charge of all of that stuff. Also most of like northern Italy too. Don't want to leave them out. Okay, so let's quickly do a little bit of a recap of the Reformation from Charles's perspective. So for Charles, the Reformation had big effects. One, he eventually had to at least acknowledge and tolerate Lutheranism, which I'm sure was a big personal affront to him. He also had to allow some regional leaders to practice Lutheranism. This is bad because part of Charles's power was the fact that he was the Holy Roman Emperor, meaning that the Pope used him as his political weapon. And if he loses the power that he gets from having everybody follow the same religion as him, that suddenly makes Charles less important. This means Charles is less effective as the Pope's political weapon. Now, eventually, like towards the end of his life, Charles is going to he will abdicate all of his thrones I think beginning in 1555. He just gives them all away. His son Philip he becomes king of Spain, and his brother Ferdinand becomes the new Holy Roman Emperor. And then Charles will just live in a monastery until he dies in 1558. So Charles is kind of broken by the Reformation, or at least that's how the story seems to go, is that fighting these wars and then losing his like ultimate authority as the Pope's political weapon causes him to need a break. And so he gives up all of his responsibility and he lives in a monastery for the rest of his life. Now, the Reformation also opens up an opportunity for the Netherlands. So quickly after the Reformation, the people of the northern part of the Netherlands, what is now the Netherlands, adopted Calvinism. So they adopted Calvinism. So let's throw up a map real quick so you see where we're talking about. We are talking about these people. So at the time, both the Netherlands and what we now know as Belgium were one country. The northern part of the Netherlands, right here, decides they're going to adopt Calvinism. That's not weird, considering that these are, it's not weird that a religion that says wealth is a sign of God's grace would be adopted by a bunch of merchants. So it kind of makes sense. The people of the Netherlands were well known for being merchants and traders, and so a religion that says wealth is a sign of God's grace, it kind of goes with that. So these guys quickly adopted Calvinism. The problem with that is that Philip, who is now the King of Spain, is a super Catholic and wants to control the people of the Netherlands. So Philip is a super Catholic. He owns the Netherlands. It was part of the stuff that his father gave him. And so he wants to control the people of the Netherlands. He's not okay with them adopting Calvinism. And so the Netherlands, the northern part of the Netherlands, declares independence in 1581. And this marks the start of what's sometimes called the 80 Years' War. It's also known as the War for Dutch Independence. This is also Dutch independence. So this process starts in 1581 and it's going to continue for a while. The Netherlands essentially becomes independent in 1588. And the reason they become independent in 1588 is that the English defeat the Spanish Armada, which is just a giant fleet. It's a giant naval fleet. And that leaves Spain with nothing to fight the Dutch with. So essentially, the Netherlands become independent in 1588. They're not officially independent. Spain does not recognize them as being independent. But they're essentially independent because there's very little the Spanish can do to stop them from becoming independent. And so these guys become known as the United Provinces. We know them today as the Netherlands, but at the time they are the United Provinces, and they actually form a republic because they really couldn't find anybody to be a monarch. So they operate as a republic. And we'll be talking more about the Dutch, especially when we take a day to talk about like early modern European economies. The Dutch are super involved in that. So we'll talk more about the Dutch when we get to there. But right now, I think the idea is that the Dutch are independent as a result of them switching to Calvinism and Philip wanting them to come back. So it starts a war, but it's a war that doesn't really end with a whole lot of fighting between the Spanish and the Dutch. The Dutch just kind of fall backwards into independence. Now, the last thing I want to do very quickly, because there's not much going on here, but I do want to take a minute and just talk briefly about Eastern Europe. As we said in the last video, we have this debate between who's going to be the guarantor of law and order and property rights. In Western Europe, it becomes very apparent that that's going to be the kings of these countries. In Eastern Europe, however, that falls into the nobility. The nobility is in charge here, which gives us a more decentralized government. So we get a more decentralized government in Eastern Europe. It is a little bit more free, like there's more freedom for people, but it also means there's less united defenses. So if somebody were to attack you in Eastern Europe, which is going to happen, it's very hard to mount a united defense because everybody is off kind of doing their own thing. So it's a trade-off. You have more freedom, but you're less able to organize a coordinated defense. So there's two places that I want to just mention very briefly. The first one is Poland. Now, in medieval Europe, we see a big alliance between Poland and Lithuania. This was a major force in Eastern Europe. Poland, Lithuania was a big country, a big powerful country in Eastern Europe. Their kings were elected by the nobility, kind of in the same way that the Holy Roman Emperor was elected by the nobility. So what this does is it means that the king has limited power, but it also means that it's pretty easy to divide them. All you have to do is, bribe a couple of nobles, and they'll stop supporting the king, and they'll support a new king. So it's pretty easy to divide these guys up. The other place I want to talk about just for a second is Russia. These are the two major powers in Eastern Europe. So remember, I think the last time we talked about Russia, they had just kicked out the Mongols. They kicked out the Mongols, and it was the princes of Moscow who organized this rebellion. And so that makes Moscow the new capital. Of what is now Russia. Russia now kind of exists. So the guy that led this rebellion was named Ivan III. His son is known as Ivan IV. He takes the title Tsar of the Russians. He's also known as Ivan the Terrible. Now, this word terrible in English is kind of a mistranslation. In Russian, the word terrible means more like awesome or like causing fear. Like he inspires awe or he inspires fear. He's terrible in that way. He causes you to be terrified of him. Ivan was a ruler much like the Polish rulers in that the nobility allowed him to stay in power, but Ivan was much more paranoid and started creating his own secret police. He created a secret police force to monitor the nobility. So he created this secret police force to monitor the nobility. These guys, the nobility in Russian, these guys are known as the Boyars. Ivan was a very angry man. And so I'm just going to continue this up here. So Ivan was an angry man, and he actually killed his own son in a fit of rage. And he was left without an heir. And so the nobility, the Boyars, elected a new Tsar, one they could control. So they elect a new Tsar, one that they could control. His name was Mikhail Romanov, who is going to start the Romanov dynasty, which will last until 1917, when the Bolsheviks overthrow the Tsar and take over the Russian government. But we're way far away from that. So they do this in 1613. So they do that in 1613. So yeah, sorry I got a little long-winded at the end. I didn't think that would take quite so much. So I kind of crammed a lot in there at the end. But the nice thing about videos is that you can always just pause it and rewind and listen again. Hopefully you're doing that. Hopefully you're watching these and stopping and recording what I'm saying and recording what I'm writing. Hopefully these are useful to you. So that's it on New Monarchies. So remember, the big takeaway from New Monarchies is that this is kind of the first step in kings centralizing their power. This is like their first step towards absolute monarchy, which we will get to in time period 2. But for right now, we're just kind of taking those first initial steps into centralizing the government. And we see that in several different ways, like with the Spanish doing it with a religious conflict, with the Holy Roman Empire and Philip in Spain, kind of fighting a civil war with the Netherlands. And then you kind of see the Russians start to do it, but kind of doing it in a different way where they are attacking their own nobility. So I'm going to stop there. And so that's the end of our stuff on New Monarchies. The next video will start our other topic about the effects of the Renaissance and the Reformation, which will be a longer series on exploration. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.